Self-forgiveness is one of the most powerful and potent methods that we have for bringing about our own freedom, especially the freedom of our own heart. From a Buddhist perspective, forgiveness and self-forgiveness especially is a process that we undertake to lessen our own suffering, to liberate our own hearts from whatever it's holding on to, whatever it's holding against ourselves, so that we're free to offer love and care and all of the wonderful things that we have inside our heart, that we're once more able to offer those both to ourselves and also to others. Kindness, care, love. And in this session, I'll be really leaning into and sharing with you teachings that I've received from three teachers who are women, who have offered teachings also about forgiveness and self-forgiveness, namely Tara Brach. And one of the teachers at one of Tara's early women's retreats, Aruna Weissman, who is a beautiful teacher herself. And also one of the nuns who spoke about forgiveness and self-forgiveness at one of the longer retreats that I was at with Thich Nhat Hanh back in the late 80s. Forgiveness is also part of the mindful self-compassion course, and it draws from both the yin and the yang aspects of compassion. There's both the soothing and nurturing that might allow our heart to soften in its own time. But there's also the yang aspect of compassion in our self-forgiveness, which relates to courage, which also relates to clear seeing that holds ourselves and others accountable. That yang aspect of compassion that, says, perhaps we could do better. Yeah. Perhaps there are actions that I regret, that I'm noticing I'm holding against myself. But there's also that aspect there that says, I'd really like to do better in the future. That yang aspect that might hold others accountable as well for their harms. And today we're really going to be limiting our conversation to self-forgiveness, as this is often the place, a really wonderful place to start. We can practice, especially here in this retreat, within the crucible of our own heart, noticing those things that we're holding against ourselves and work with those. In this way, we can also build capacity to, in a way that is not harmful to ourselves, to also extend these same kinds of practices, approaches, and skills to offering forgiveness to others when it's the right time. Self-forgiveness is also one of those components of filling our own well first. Very often we want to, or feel like we should be forgiving others, when perhaps there are actually things that we still haven't forgiven ourselves for. If we look closely, we can see that our own heart perhaps can use some assistance, can use some attention. Today, I'd like to talk just a little bit about some of the components, some of the helpful and skillful ways that we can approach self-forgiveness. And running standalone workshops on self-forgiveness has been something that I've been doing for about 10 years now. And one of the reasons I do is that I can see the benefit of it in others. And it also has been very beneficial to myself, to allowing myself to learn and grow and transform, to be a better version of myself, and also to create more freedom inside my own heart. In Tara Brach's book, Radical Acceptance, she has a section about self-forgiveness in which she encourages us to keep our self-forgiveness practice very current. Now, one way that we can begin and enter into this practice is to not go back into our history and notice the biggest thing that we're holding against our heart. There will be time for that. But in the words of one of my MBSR colleagues, who's also a trauma therapist, Char Wilkins, she says, pick up the 5-pound weight, not the 5,000-pound weight. When we're learning something new, and we were to go to a gym or even work with a physical therapist, they would give us a lightweight first. And then we, as our muscle gets stronger and stronger and we build capacity, we can slowly and safely work up to things that feel bigger and heavier. But if we were to walk into a gym on the first day and try to pick up that 5,000-pound weight, it's very likely that we would get injured. So one of the ways that Tara has encouraged us to pick up the 5-pound weight is to stay very current and very close to ourselves. And she has created a practice called the self-forgiveness scan, something that we might actually do every day at the end of our day. If we are used to having an evening practice right before bedtime, we might include this. Or perhaps even if we're find ourselves lying in bed and going over those things at the end of the day that are coming to our mind that perhaps we didn't do so well, or we wish we had done differently, or we find ourselves struggling with or self-judging. This is a wonderful practice to do right then and there. So we'll be beginning our self-forgiveness practice today with that component, staying very close to right now, today, and perhaps the last 24 hours. Self-forgiveness is also a process. It's not one of those things that's kind of one and done. And we can see that already in the way that Tara is suggesting. It might be a process that we might enter into on a daily basis, kind of on a daily basis to check in with our own heart and notice ways that it is starting to feel like closed up in chains that we might be able to release through these practices and find a little bit more freedom before we end our day and fall into sleep. And of course, we may have a much more restful sleep if we do just that. The process of self-forgiveness often begins with, well, first of all, noticing that holding, that moment of mindfulness, that moment of making that U-turn towards ourselves. Sometimes it's that first step of the self-compassion break or that first step of rain, where we notice first that our heart is feeling tight and closed and that we are holding something against ourselves. Secondly, it can begin next with an intention to give our heart some attention, to choose self-forgiveness, and to not force that process either, but to look for those circumstances where we are feeling some willingness to even enter into the process. So we'll be doing that as well today, looking for perhaps those small things we're holding against ourselves, but that we also feel some willingness to enter into the process. Process that if it's something very small that we're wanting to forgive ourselves for, like maybe taking the last piece of chocolate out of the refrigerator when we know someone else might have really wanted it. That might be a small thing that we could forgive ourselves for completely today. But if it's something bigger and something heavier, perhaps it's a process that we will enter into today and work with our intention, allow ourselves space for the practice and the process to take as long as it takes. It's an act of generosity that we can give to ourselves. I learned a very powerful lesson about the process of forgiveness and self-forgiveness from a nun who was speaking about it at the Thich Nhat Hanh retreat. And she was speaking about the time that she was living in Vietnam during the war in the 60s and 70s. Thich Nhat Hanh and his monks and nuns were primarily working as social workers in the community there. And there was a time when, on a particular day, the US troops killed many of them. And this particular nun was also shot. And she recovered and she survived. And she was talking about this and how hard and how painful it was. And she said, I haven't yet completely forgiven those US troops who fired those shots, who killed my friends. But I've been walking in the direction of forgiveness for all those years, for decades, and that's made all the difference to my own heart. I've been walking in the direction of forgiveness, and that's made all the difference to the softening of my own heart. Knowing that we're in the process, we can feel how that might be different from just being completely 100% frozen and locked shut to something that might be in the process of softening and the process of opening. I'd like to share with you now just a hand gesture also about how we might support ourselves, and we can feel this in our own body. So I'll invite you now to sense the closed fist and allow yourself to kind of have it be closed as much as you'd like it to be, like it's closed. Like it's holding on. And sometimes our heart holds on. But if we try to force it to open. You can take your other hand and try to force it to open, and you can feel what happens. There's this like resistance. When I try to unfurl one of my fingers, I can feel it tightening even further. So we know that that approach doesn't work. On the other hand, if we just take that tight fist, allowing it to be as tight as it wants to be, and just cradle it tenderly in the other hand with no agenda. Let's just breathe here for a few breath cycles. Perhaps inviting the closed hand to feel the support of the hand that is tenderly cradling it. I myself began to feel a little natural softening without my needing to do anything except for provide some support. And that's part of the spirit that we'll enter into our self-forgiveness practice with. Setting aside striving, forcing, providing a container, a nurturing container in which our heart might loosen and begin to soften on its own with the right kind of support as well. Self-forgiveness and forgiveness in general doesn't mean that we condone anything. It doesn't mean that we're letting anyone off the hook or not holding ourselves or others responsible for any harms that we or others may have caused. In fact, often when we allow our heart to soften, you can sense how we may have the full capacity of our own being. We may have more access to our entire self and our entire wisdom about how to do just that. So as part of the practice that we'll be doing, there is a step that asks us to inquire, to see if there was any harm on the inside, because we're working with self-forgiveness. And we're particularly going to be working with, again, something that we're, holding against ourselves. We'll be noticing if there are any harms that can be named. If we feel a sense of regret inside our heart, and noticing if there are any amends or actions that need to be taken. So we won't be spending a lot of time if you do have a sense that there are actions or amends that need to be taken. Today, it's just a matter of noticing that and perhaps setting the intention to give that more time in the future. Maybe that something spontaneously will arise. Today, it's more noticing that as a step that you might like to revisit. A step that is along the way to then offering ourselves some words of support that might encourage that sense of entering into the process of self-forgiveness. And the particular phrases that we're working with today are ones that primarily are ones that come from Irina Weissman, again, that I learned from her while she was one of the co-teachers at one of Tara's women's retreats, probably about 15 years ago. And these words so touched my own heart that I wrote them down and I carried them forward and now have been offering them to others for quite a number of years. when I was at one of Tara's retreats, and she was inviting us into this practice of noticing what we were holding against ourselves. Tara offered the simple words, forgiven, forgiven. And these words are ones that melt my own heart. There are others as well, but these are ones that I have carried forward myself and use really on a daily basis, many times a day, especially when I notice self-judging is arising, self-criticism is arising for something that perhaps some minuscule thing that might have been more skillful. And I turn towards myself with these words, forgiven, forgiven. And it often, not always, but often when I catch it right in the moment, it helps that that spinning thinking begin to just dissolve. And then taking from the teachings of the nun at the Thich Nhat Hanh retreat, I've added a final phrase that draws from those teachings as well. So there'll be an opportunity to work with the phrases and then to notice which one or ones, or perhaps just a part of the phrase actually touches you the most. And that's the one that I encourage you to continue practicing with. These phrases aren't offered with the intent or even the thought that all of them are going to work for everyone. It's really more of a process of hearing and noticing what's working best for you.